You can have feedback, you can have algorithms and frameworks and scripts, but they're all going to be widely ineffective if you are coming from a place of judgment or anger.
What I like to do with giving feedback to Jayed and Sanvi is to get down to their eye level.
Yes.
Right?
As a South Asian female, something that I've experienced on the flip side is I don't want to say anything. Should I say something? And what happens then is it's not the reactivity, but the lack of responsiveness. And now you're drawing this out. While the other person likely has moved on.
A lot of us are walking around with a set of instructions and manuals that we haven't shared with the other person, right?
Dinesh, I had a really awesome Mother's Day.
That's good.
Yeah.
All Mother's Day should be awesome.
All Mother's Day should be awesome. It wasn't a traditional Mother's Day in that sense, but my son, who doesn't really love cooking, decided he wanted to be the one to make me dinner on Mother's Day.
Oh, amazing.
Yeah. And so, you know, Mansi's usually the one in the kitchen. She's pretty proficient by herself, actually. But he was like, nope, I don't want help. I'm going to make Mom and Mansi dinner. And Manish was on call. So it was just him. And he made us peanut butter waffles with, I like to put the jelly in smiley faces.
Okay. Yeah.
Like that's how I used to do it when they were toddlers. So he wanted to recreate that meal for me.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah. So it was really sweet. We enjoyed our meal and, you know, went on our way. And then the next morning, kids were still in bed. I woke up, hadn't had my, you know, hot water yet. I hadn't really started my day yet.
Yeah.
But I go into the kitchen and boom, I step in something really sticky and gross on the floor.
Oh, no. What did you step in? Was it a dead mouse or something?
It's a glob of peanut butter.
Oh.
And when I went to steady myself on the counter, my hand landed in something sticky too, which was dried jelly.
Oh, wow.
And so I was obviously thrown. I was a little annoyed, you know, and then I realized that the reason the mess existed was because Arjun had made dinner for us for the first time ever the night before, right? And so I'm sitting here and I'm looking and it's like, okay, he's obviously tried to clean it up because it's not completely just a mess. He just didn't do it maybe the way an adult would have cleaned that mess up.
Yeah.
And so then I'm like, all right, I've got to let him know, but I don't want to crush his spirit. Right? And I feel like parenting gives us all sorts of opportunities to really fine tune the way we lead, even professionally, because there's always these unexpected things that come up and you kind of have to pivot and get perspective really fast, right?
Absolutely. You got to be able to manage your mind on the fly.
Yeah. Yeah. So I'm sure your kids have put you in similar situations where they've said or done something, or maybe they've gotten sick and you're now managing a shift in things and you have ways to help them. You've got feedback to give them so that they can learn and correct and grow as human beings.
Yeah.
But there's an art to that. There's a skill to that.
Both personally and professionally, right?
Right.
I think there is a way to interact with other humans in a way that's productive, and there's certainly a way that's unproductive.
Right. You don't want to crush them, and you don't want to demotivate them.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that was sort of my impetus for thinking about, okay, how is it that I have gotten more comfortable at giving feedback? Is that as a people pleaser, that has never been my strong suit. And I know, to clarify, I'm not saying feedback like, you did such a great job, I want to tell you and celebrate how amazing you are. I'm talking about something's not quite right and it needs some attention.
Right. An area for improvement, right? We're not talking about feedback as praise or slap on the back, that attaboy, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's fun and easy, and, you know, anytime is a good time to give praise.
Yeah.
I would imagine.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I thought today we could go into what your tips are and what my tips are based on our experiences about how do we give feedback? How do we give that in a way that's motivating, that continues to build trust, that continues to foster teamwork and help the people that we're giving feedback to be the best versions of themselves?
Nah, can we just talk about pizza instead?
Nah. What kind of pizza?
I don't know, but I'm craving pizza. I'm trying to derail this podcast episode, see if we can talk about pizza instead.
Oh, wow. Pizza.
Feedback it is.
I
Yeah.
really struggle with this because less so now, but the people pleasing, I tend to, and this is what many of my coaching clients come to me with is the same thing. Like I have this thing to say, but I don't really know how to say it because I don't want to be demanding.
Hmm.
And it stresses them out, right? The
Hmm.
idea of giving feedback can be very stressful, so much so that we avoid it or
Hmm.
we tend to play the victim of like, oh, this never works out for me. I'm so
Hmm.
terrible at this. Like it's going to go awful. And then self-fulfilling prophecy. And then,
Yeah.
we're kind of proving to ourselves why we're bad at giving feedback.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
If we think it, that's gonna be our experience of it.
Yeah. So let's fix it. Let's give our listeners some strategies to help mitigate unwanted outcomes for feedback.
Yeah, and I think we can share some strategies, but a lot of the things that we share are probably based on our experiences and our context and a lot of, factually dependent things or contours. And
Hmm.
I think that it's important with any strategy or any advice that you get to really think about, whether it's appropriate or whether it makes sense in that scenario or any need to tailor it or modify it or omit or add. So I think we plan to share are both from a professional and personal perspective, right?
Right.
And some might be applicable in one scenario and maybe completely useless in another, right?
Right. Yes. As one of my favorite yoga instructors says, I make suggestions, you make decisions, take what feels good to you and leave the rest with kindness. So that's
Yeah,
where we're
I
at.
like that. That
Yeah.
that's actually good. I think I'm going to steal that. So whoever the yoga teacher is, tell me so I can give them credit.
That's Dennis Morton on Peloton Yoga. So
Oh,
I
Dennis
love,
Morton. Shout
yes.
out to Dennis.
Shout out to Dennis. He's awesome. Yeah. So what I did in the case of my kids, right?
Hmm.
I had to, so I knew I was giving feedback when I sort of stepped into the sticky mess and they were not in the room at the time. So in that case, I actually had a little bit of a moment to sort of get clear, get centered and figure out, all right, what do I want to say?
Hmm.
So when they came down, I
Well, wait,
didn't,
can I interrupt you?
yeah,
Isn't it an important point to decide whether or not you're going to give feedback?
absolutely.
It sounds like you decided that. Maybe you want to talk a little bit about that step there to say this is a feedback or teaching moment
Hmm.
versus now is not the right time or this is not a
Exactly.
good example. That the issue isn't ripe enough to give feedback.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Especially with, I think even when you're managing people, but especially as parents, you don't want to be the nag, right? If
Mhm.
you're constantly correcting, they're not going to be receptive anyway. And so I think that's a great point. In this case, I decided that it was important to give feedback for a multitude of reasons, but
Mhm.
I was clear that I wanted to give feedback. But I also knew that I could do it in a compassionate way.
Yeah.
So there was a very intentional decision um, to say, all right, let's correct this, but I don't want to make it this huge
Yeah.
deal.
Can you share why you decided that this was a good time to give feedback?
I think that, it's well, for us personally, we have been talking to the kids more and more. They've been making their lunches before school started or
Mhm.
before the night before. And so we've talked to them about, okay, when you're in the kitchen or you're doing a procedure, your whole thing is not just the action itself, right? It's not
Yeah.
making lunch itself.
Yeah.
It's prepping everything, pulling everything out, closing the refrigerator door as you're pulling things out so you're not wasting energy. And then
Hmm.
it's also the cleanup. If
Right.
you've made a mess, you wipe up the crumbs, you take a cloth, you clean up, you look around, make sure there's nothing else that you can do to leave the environment a little bit better than it was maybe when you got there. So
Right.
this was an ongoing learning point and conversation point
Hmm.
between Manish and myself with both of the
The
kids,
kids. Yeah.
right?
Okay. Yeah. That context is helpful because otherwise, I don't want the listeners to be left with your son makes you dinner for the first time on Mother's Day, and that was the best opportunity to give feedback. It sounds like this is an ongoing teaching moment.
It was. And
Yeah.
importantly, I was going to touch on this a little bit later, but I had the time and
Mm,
space to process what that felt like. I wasn't in a place where I was going to be annoyed when I was
right.
giving this feedback,
Okay.
right? So
Hmm.
that's really important too, because you can have feedback, you can have algorithms and frameworks and scripts, and all of them are great to get clarity and focus and help you think through, all right, what is really the issue here and what does need to be addressed? But they're all going to be widely ineffective if you are coming from a place of judgment or anger, or nitpickiness. You know,
Hmm.
that it just doesn't work as well. People can feel that energy and they feel judged. And then that makes them feel like, oh, I don't really want to hear what you have to say.
Right. Yeah. People will
Yeah.
shut down.
Yeah. And I
Yeah.
mean, I do too. I know when Manish says stuff to me and he has every wonderful intention in the book, and I'm just not in a place to say it or to
Yeah.
hear it. Now I've gotten to the point where I'm like, you know what, babe, I'm not interested right now, but
Hmm.
maybe later I might come around, right? But
Hmm.
just not right now.
Hmm.
But not everyone feels like they can say that. That's a learned skill for me. I've not, always been great at advocating for what I wanted or what I needed in the moment. So anyway, I decided that I was going to give feedback.
Hmm.
Um, Importantly, I decided when I was going to give feedback because I knew I didn't want to just have him come downstairs and then just say, hey, there was this mess and
Hmm.
you didn't clean it up and you should have, right?
Hmm.
Um, so what I did was they came down, we said good morning, we did our normal thing. I let the kids go on and on with their routines. And importantly, I had decided to clean up the mess before they
Hmm.
came down because I didn't want to step in it again and, all that. So when they came down, I checked out where Arjun was and he seemed to be in a pretty good mood.
Hmm.
And so then I said, hey, bud, I really, really appreciated that you made dinner last night. That was super special.
Hmm.
Right.
Yeah.
Um, and then I asked for permission. And that's really kind of my first strategy that I would offer to people is when you have something to say, ask for permission
Hmm.
because not everyone is open to it.
Hmm.
And not everyone, even if they're open to it, it may just not be a good time, right? If you're catching a coworker as they're rushing out the door to pick up their kid, and now you want to talk to them about the way they sent an email or the latest project updates, I wouldn't be as receptive to that as if the coworker had said, hey, I have a question about this, or I have some thoughts about this. Is now
Yeah.
a good time, or should we find a time to do it?
Yeah. Yeah. No, I definitely agree. I think, you know, maybe not asking for permission, but ensuring it's a right time is
Yes.
probably the way I would phrase it, as opposed to sort of barging in because you have no idea if what someone's priorities are or what urgency or anything that's going on. So I think definitely scheduling a time so that folks aren't pulled in many different directions
Mhm.
or there are no distractions or things like that, and ensuring that the environment or the atmosphere is one that's not only conducive or useful for the feedback recipient, but
Mhm.
also for you, right?
Mm.
You want to give any feedback or criticism from a place that's genuine
Mhm.
and, authentic and empathetic and understanding.
Right.
So if it is, if you're rushing or you're on the phone and you're, just off the cuff giving some feedback, it's going to affect the way it is received, based on the gravity or importance that you're giving it, right?
Mm.
And if you're giving feedback from doing a bunch of different things and it doesn't seem that that's important, if you don't care, why should I care? Right?
Hmm.
So I think it's important for both of those to ensure that when you are giving feedback, you're both in a place, both the recipient and the giver, in a place that um, accurately communicates the importance and the empathy and the understanding, and that you're taking care. And the other thing I'd share is that something that was said to me in 12th grade, I
Mm.
think. When people make fun of people, like jokes and poke fun or things like that,
Yeah.
um, you rarely ever make fun of someone who's a stranger,
Oh, yeah.
right?
Right.
And so if you feel comfortable enough to make fun of someone or to correct someone, there is a vein of caring about that person so much that you're trying to make them better, or you're trying
Mm.
to give your opinion, whether your opinion is right or wrong. But just the very fact that you want to take the time out of your day and share something with that person, there's a level of caring for that person, interest in that person, a level of wanting to mentor or coach that person. And so you want to make sure that's communicated, that you're doing this in what you hope to be a positive outcome, not because you don't care or that, you don't have time for it, or you're trying to be negative or something like that. And I think that
Yeah.
comes across from having a dedicated time where you're in a good, clean place.
Yeah. So tell us a story if you don't mind sharing. You mentioned something about 12th grade.
Oh, no, it was just, something that was shared with me back then that, if someone
Oh,
feels
you're
comfortable to make fun of you or to pick on you, it's not necessarily because it's a bad thing. It means that they feel a level of closeness with you, right?
understood. Understood.
To
Yes.
to be able to do that. And I think
Gotcha.
same is applicable. If someone feels a level of closeness with you or a level of caring,
Hmm.
then and only then would they give feedback. But if they think it's useless or they don't care or they feel it won't be received or nothing good will come of the feedback, I think most people would default to not doing it.
Yeah, absolutely. And what comes to mind when you say that is that it's not only are they in a good mental space,
Right.
you as the giver and them as the receiver, but also environmentally. I know
Hmm.
this comes into play, especially when privacy is a big deal. Like I would imagine in a law firm, I know for me in a hospital or clinic setting, there are other people around. And so
Hmm.
if you have feedback about how something went with a patient, um, or even whether it was a direct patient interaction or not, giving feedback while there are patients walking around, while there are other nurses or MAs or something walking around, that is now a non-private conversation. It's a public one, and
Yeah.
can be that same conversation given in a private setting will have a very different outcome potentially. So just being mindful of physically where you're at too.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't think that's only applicable to professional settings. I think it's totally applicable with family and friends and kids.
Yes.
A lot of times a child or my kid or someone else's kid might do something in public, but giving the feedback then or correcting them right then, like, even if someone, makes a mistake on the soccer field or something like that,
Mhm.
um, that giving that correction or feedback right then might have an impact on the rest of the game, right?
Mhm.
Might be embarrassing to a kid, right?
Yeah.
Um, and so I think that that's true. But I want to go back to your point of environment. I think the environment that you're in, and this goes along with sort of body language too, nonverbal communication, right?
Mm.
On how you show up. I think the environment is super, super important. More important, I'd say, than a lot of other things, because let's just say a professional setting, asking someone to come into your office and close the door, there's
Mm.
a power dynamic there. You're behind the desk,
Yeah.
they're in your office, you've asked to close the door, versus asking someone to meet you in a conference room. There's a different dynamic there, right? There's even more
Mhm.
formal. Or as opposed to going for a walk to get a coffee,
Mhm.
right? So even if you're going for a walk and it's not a private, it's a public environment,
Mhm.
um, you know, you could be in a public environment and give feedback as long as you're outside of someone's earshot. I mean, again, depending on what it is, but I think being mindful of the environment and the nonverbal cues that might come from
Right.
that is something to pay attention to.
Absolutely. You bring up such an important point. It's a huge influencer in terms of your energy, the person who's receiving the feedback, their energy. And importantly, even power dynamic of where, but then are you behind this big desk or are
Yeah,
you side by side walking with them as a peer? Right.
exactly.
It makes such a big difference.
It does. And going back to kids, what I like to do with giving feedback to Jayed and Sanvi is to get down to their eye level,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
Um, and I want to be clear. I want to repeat what I said. It's get down to their eye level.
Yep.
The flip is not the same, which is to stand them up on something to your eye level. I think
Mm-hmm.
if you ask them to stand up and look to your eye level, that has a significantly less warm connotation than if you come down to their eye level. So the eye level isn't that important. It's just that you're meeting them and where they are,
Where
as
they
opposed to
are.
them meeting you where you are.
Absolutely. So important. It's something that I learned very early on that is so simple, right? It doesn't take extra time. It just takes a little bit of intention. And I feel like it's really made a huge difference with how I interact with my kids. Even when
Yeah.
I'm giving praise,
Hmm.
even when I'm giving praise, for me to get down on their level and say, oh my gosh, I love how you drew this, or I love how you made the bed. It is warm. And
Hmm.
oftentimes it will set us up to have one of those spontaneous big mama papa bear hugs that we
Mm.
all cherish so much,
Yeah,
especially as they get older. So
absolutely.
yeah,
Absolutely.
so good. But I think Dinesh, you were mentioning before we hit record that it's not just whether or not you're mentally in the right space
Hmm.
and environmentally in the right space and physically in terms of behind a desk versus at their eye level, but also the time,
Yeah.
the timeliness of it. So can you talk more about that so our listeners can understand what you meant?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just as it says, it's timeliness. I mean, we all live in a much faster world than before, and I think
Hmm.
the one of the earlier episodes we had just a couple of weeks ago with Abhijit Baduri, we
Hmm.
talked about timeliness and how things are so much more sped up, basically, right? We
Right.
want feedback and responsiveness, and in a professional setting, waiting until 6 months or a year to bring something to someone's attention might be a little late.
Hmm.
And even in a family setting, I think that feedback is most valuable when it is as close to contemporaneous as possible, right? In
Hmm.
in real time, as close to possible, because you're everyone's fresh, you're on the same page, you can make small corrections as opposed to things compounding over time. But there's a risk to doing that. And the risk is if you're triggered and if you're
Right.
totally upset and you try to do it right then. So I give the caveat of, timeliness is subjective, but, if you get a mean email, spend the night, like sleep on it.
Hmm.
Don't hit send right away. Try not to react when you're giving feedback, but more importantly, ensure that you're responding in a constructive and helpful way, which goes back to what I was trying to say with the story in when I was 12 or in sixth grade or
Mm.
whatever, which is that your aim or goal in giving feedback must be one that has a slant of improving someone. It
Right.
isn't to cut someone down. It isn't to prove your point or to prove you're right. It certainly can't be to make your ego feel good in that moment, but it has to be from almost an altruistic perspective of like, I have some information that I think really could help you.
Hmm.
And from there, I think timeliness is a secondary factor.
I love that you drew out that nuance. And as you said, when you come from a place of service and improvement, it's way different
Yes.
than uh, as my friend Dr. Jeff Tumlin says, he's a communications expert, and he says, don't pin the tail on the donkey.
Yes.
I told you so is never a good enough reason to give any sort of feedback. And so I think that is an appropriate use of your energy when you do
Yeah.
that out of service to somebody else.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Absolutely. I think that is the sole purpose of feedback,
right.
right?
And it, I I think it detracts as a South Asian female. Something that I've experienced on the flip side is I don't want to say anything. Should I say something? I don't want to upset them. And what happens then is you it's not the reactivity, but the
Hmm.
lack of responsiveness. And
Hmm.
now you're drawing this out, right? This thing, and you're playing this story in your mind. And
Hmm.
meanwhile, the other person likely has moved on.
Hmm.
And so it's weighing on you and weighing on you, and it's stealing your bandwidth, it's stealing your ability to be present in the moment, and it's stealing your joy, your ability to be effective.
Yeah.
And so then it also taxes relationships. So for example, when Manish and I first got married, my parents communicate very differently than his parents do. And so I would hold on to things,
Hmm.
and I wouldn't actually say what I wanted to say. And all of a sudden, then I would wind up exploding on him.
Hmm.
And it took me years and him partnering with me to say, if you, if you need to share something with me, say it then. Don't wait a month or a week or
Yeah.
6 months or a year. Cause I don't know what you're talking about when you're talking about that one night that I must have said something or did something. And that was a
Yeah.
year ago, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I definitely agree with that. Timeliness is key.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the other thing I wanted to talk about was the importance of being concise.
Hmm.
When you're saying something that may be uncomfortable or in the spirit of improvement, know what you want to say, know why you want to say it, and say it.
Hmm.
Don't ramble on and try to give example after example after example. Pick a recent example if possible. That goes back to our timeliness. Say what you want to say. And
Hmm.
importantly, after you've said your piece, this is my favorite question, is what do you think
Hmm.
about that? Like, give them space to process and reflect on the fact that you've said something that now you want them to take and internalize.
Yeah. Yeah, I like that. Not only in sort of feedback, but any conversation, right? You always want to deliberately create space allow people to share what's coming up for them. How are they reacting? Do you agree with me? Am I missing something? Because a
Hmm.
lot of times, we could be providing feedback or from our perception, which is
Hmm.
incorrect because we don't
Hmm.
have it's based on assumptions and things like that. So I generally agree with being concise, like you said. I think that's all right, giving them space and in being concise, what I hear is being specific and clear, right?
Yeah.
So you want to avoid generalizations. You want to stop or not do any broad strokes, right? You want to
Hmm.
have specific concrete examples to illustrate your points. And I think also what sometimes is overlooked when there's a pattern is a tendency to focus on personality traits, right? Like something like you always do that, or you never let me finish speaking, right? And I think the minute you do that and you stop focusing on a specific behavior and you're focusing on something that's always, I think you can lose a lot of credibility because they're like, what are you talking about? Like, give me one example, right?
Hmm.
And then you're back and forth in this debate of proving evidence as opposed to going with specific behaviors, and
Right.
you're now wading into, I don't know if this is fair to say, but you're wading into the territory of personal attacks and
Mm.
character assassination and judgment and personality traits. And again, that's more victimhood and blaming as opposed
Mhm.
to giving feedback.
Yeah, what I'm hearing you say is that instead of having there be a clear offense and a defense, have it be one of collaboration.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yep. You want to collaborate and you want to make it clear that your interests in this are aligned, right?
Mm.
So, why should you care about my feedback? And an acceptable answer isn't that because I feel bad about what you did,
Hmm.
right? Um, why should you care? Like, why? If I'm giving Jayan some feedback on the soccer field, it's so that he can improve, right?
Right.
Or if I'm telling him that he shouldn't drink soda or coffee or whatever it is that kids want to try, I want to explain to him that, it's bad for your teeth, or, you're going to get, too hyper or whatever,
Hmm.
and then you're going to mess up your sleep later.
Hmm.
And same in a professional setting, that, hey, when you sent that email, that tone could make you seem a little passive aggressive,
Hmm.
right? If you don't want to seem passive aggressive, here's my thought for you,
Right.
right? Or whatever specific scenario it is.
Yeah. And that brings up for me, there's feedback that's you have space to make suggestions to improvement. And
Yeah.
then there's feedback where it's like, hey, we're not going to scream at coworkers in the office,
Hmm.
or we're not going to hit daddy, or we're
Yeah.
not going to, we're not going to throw things at the dinner table, right? There are types of feedback where there's a hard boundary. And then there's other things like with soccer where you have the liberty to say, I think if you tried it this way, you
Hmm.
might have an easier time scoring a goal,
Yeah.
right? Like there's ways to play with this.
Yeah, absolutely. And like we said, all of this is so, so, so nuanced,
Hmm. Yeah.
right? And you know, I'm not sure. I never practiced giving feedback. I was never instructed on how to give feedback. And so a lot of this will take time and experience, and um, you'll find your own style. You'll
Yeah.
find what works for you and what you're comfortable with. Um, And, I'm thinking back to all the times I've given feedback, and I've given feedback a lot, more than I can count. I've had all sorts of reactions that you can imagine under the sun. Like whatever reaction you're coming up in your mind,
Hmm.
um, times it by 10 and then add 20 to it, then I've had that reaction.
Yeah.
So, it's all totally nuanced, and you'll develop your own style, and it not only develop it once, but it will evolve
Right.
as you evolve and your situations evolve.
Absolutely. Generally speaking, I would say unsolicited advice is what I try to stay away from.
Yeah.
Um, that being said, to what you said earlier, if there's a vested interest for the other person and I care about them, and or importantly, I see a greater win
Hmm.
by offering feedback that's collaborative,
Hmm.
um, then I will decide, do I want to give feedback? Do I not want to give feedback? And if so, how do I give it?
Yeah.
Um, I think the other thing too is we tend to fall back to the ways we were given feedback as a kid,
Mm.
right? I'm not hugely well versed in psychology or anything, but from what I understand is, we either fall back to the ways we were given feedback or we
Hmm.
fall back to the opposite of how we were given feedback
Yeah.
as a kid. And so I know, even a lot of parenting experts will say this too, do not compare
Hmm.
your child to your other child, right?
Hmm.
Or to their cousin, or to one student to the other students, one colleague to another colleague, but rather compare to their own journey. Where
Hmm.
was this child yesterday
Hmm.
versus where they are today,
Yeah.
and where they can go tomorrow, right? Because everybody's on their own path. And really, I know we have standardizations and we have tests and things to measure, is somebody within the realm of, like in Texas we have the STAR test, right? In public
Hmm.
schools, like are you at fifth grade level or not?
Hmm.
Um, but having that standardization is just one data point, right?
Hmm.
What's more important is, where are you specifically as an individual?
Yeah. That's the whole game. Where are you? Where have you been, and where are you going, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah. So I think we have a couple more things to share about things to consider before we wrap up, right? And I think
Yeah.
we might have touched on some of this. Nonverbal communication, pay attention to your body language, pay attention to your tone of voice, right? All of those things are part of the experience,
Hmm.
and whether the reception of what you're sharing and the gravity and the importance and all of that stuff. And I think there's no right answer. I think just aligning your tone and body language and other nonverbal communication with the specific situation, the outcome you're hoping for, the audience, who you're with, all that stuff is can make such a huge difference on how the feedback is delivered and received. And I think as a just a general communication point, the person delivering a message is responsible for how it's received and whether it's received in the same way that it was meant to be delivered, right?
Mm.
So I think paying attention to your nonverbal communication and cues and things like that is an important consideration to focus on.
Absolutely. I think, whether you take something as helpful or not helpful, people know when you're judging them.
Hmm.
And whether they're conscious of it or not, and whether you're conscious of it or not, that judgment can be felt.
Yeah.
And so it's not the action itself, but it's the intention behind the action that ultimately determines the outcome. So one other thing I wanted to sort of give listeners was just a set of questions to think about when partnering
Hmm.
with finding a solution, especially when you don't have one in mind, right? Like in my case with the kids, it was, I want you to get a wet cloth and here's where it is and we want to clean it up. We want to make sure. But I did follow a little bit of this framework in that what resources do you need? Right?
Hmm.
When you're making a mess and it's sticky, will a dry cloth cover it? Well,
Hmm.
likely not, right? So what will you need? Do you know where those things are? Do you know where those materials are?
Hmm.
What might get in the way of you being able to do this successfully, right? If you're in a rush, if you're not paying attention, if you're arguing with each other, there's a million reasons why you might forget or you might not think about this,
Hmm.
right? Importantly, how would you like to be accountable? This is, not so much for the peanut butter situation, but I think in work situations, even with school, and there are definitely parts of parenting where I do want my kids to learn accountability. And
Yeah.
so we have to partner with them, right? How
Yeah.
do you want me to remind you? Do you want to set a reminder yourself? Do you want to leave yourself a note? What is it that's going to help you remember to do it differently next time?
Yeah. Yeah, I think those are all good. Seema, one thing that just popped into my mind that I think is worth mentioning is, oftentimes a lot of us are walking around with a set of instructions and manuals that we haven't shared with the other person, right?
Mm,
And I think it's important to be sure that you're giving feedback on something where your expectations are aligned,
yeah,
right? And it's not on something that the other person doesn't have it on their radar, right? So in Arjun's case, um, if he, and I know this is not the case, but if he didn't know that it's inappropriate to leave peanut butter out
yeah,
on the thing, then you're giving feedback on something that doesn't need to be given feedback on. And I think there's a lot of cases like that. If someone comes into your house and don't doesn't take off their shoes because they don't
right.
take off their shoes in their house, and then you sit them down, you go for a walk. Yeah, I'd like to talk to you. Like when you came into my house, it's very disrespectful. I think that might miss the boat a little bit.
Yeah,
So in professional settings or personal settings or things like that, I think before endeavoring on giving feedback, you want to make sure that that it's a feedback appropriate time,
yeah,
right?
yeah. Not all feedback is helpful.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's better to just, if you choose not to give feedback, though, I think this is also important. Let it go. Really,
Hmm.
truly let it go. Don't
Yeah.
harbor it. Don't fester on it because that takes a toll on your own ability to perform and succeed and be happy.
Yeah.
And it can cost you in a relationship dearly.
That's a really good point. I don't think that um, every time someone feels wronged or something has done, you know, different than your expectation, it's worth it for you to give
Hmm.
feedback or to try to correct that behavior.
Hmm.
One of my favorite sayings is that if you stop and bark at every dog that barks at you, you're never going to get where you're going, right? And I think
Yeah.
there's a lot to be said to don't sweat the small stuff.
Hmm.
There's a lot to be said of, water under the bridge. There's a lot to be said of, letting it slide off your back, and being judicious with how much you how much responsibility you give yourself for correcting a number of things. And my final point is that sometimes it's better to let the person figure it out themselves,
Hmm.
right? Um, you know, like I have no doubt, zero doubt in my mind that had you not said anything to Urgent, there would come a time where maybe when he's in college or when he's married or something like that, there would come a time where he figured out how to clean up peanut butter himself,
Right.
right?
Right.
So I think sometimes if we're quick to correct, we take away the learning opportunity
Hmm.
sometimes. I think Philip talked about this a little bit.
Absolutely. He
Yeah,
mentioned, don't deny somebody their bottom, right?
right. Yeah,
Because, and that's what coaching is. That's what real learning is when it comes from ourselves, we're more likely to buy in, we're more likely to follow through, we're more likely to be engaged.
yeah,
Um, I know for me, when I was growing up, I probably didn't help my mom as much as around the house with laundry and keeping things clean and all of that. But the moment I had my own apartment, oh, buddy, like
yeah,
everything was clean, everything was put away, everything was cared for very differently because now there's more ownership. So,
yeah.
things evolve and change and we just roll with the punches.
Yeah, and Simon Sinek makes a really good point, especially like you said on ownership. And he specifically makes a point relative to brushing teeth of kids,
Oh, tell me, tell
right?
me.
Well, basically he says like as long as you're keeping ownership of the cleanliness of their teeth, there's no incentive for them to take that ownership,
Hmm.
right? And so you have to sort of let go and expect sort of the dip in cleanliness of teeth so that they can pick up the ownership. So as long as you're still keeping ownership of a
Hmm.
project or the cleanliness of the kitchen or whatever it is, there is no reason why someone else should pick up that ownership,
Yes.
right?
Absolutely. So true. So true. And it can be eye-opening when you realize, oh gosh, I've been owning this responsibility for so
Absolutely.
long
Yeah,
and it's taxed me, but it's also deprived them of the opportunity to,
exactly.
to step up to the plate, figure it out themselves, have pride
Yeah.
in doing whatever it is that you're doing. So all excellent points.